Hi, everybody. I am back for chapter 4. This one's a little longer. So, what do we know so far? We know that 5 members of the family got sick. By family, I mean people that lived in the household. We know that they returned back to Long Island or New York City, one of the two. We know that Mary didn't go with them. We know the Thompsons returned to their home at the beach that they had been staying in, or the Warren family had been staying in, and had the health department inspect everything, and they said, okay, this is fine. We're not seeing any trouble. Who knows, basically, is what they said. But at the end of the last chapter, it kind of implied that Miss Thompson, the owner of the home, well, her and her husband own the home, but the owner wanted to really look further into it because she said, hey, if this is my house and it's got something wrong with it, I need to know because I don't need more people getting sick. I don't want to get sick, all that kind of stuff. So that is where we are moving forward. This chapter is called In Which an Epidemic Fighter Hunts for a Cure. As the days passed, Miss Thompson fretted. The local people were gossiping about her house. Even though health inspectors had examined every nook and cranny, even though every test had been performed, even though every test result had come back negative, even though the health inspectors had closed the case, the townspeople continued to speculate that the water was bad. Fall turned to winter, and Mrs. Thompson worried about the next summer, wondering if she'd be able to rent the Oyster Bay house. Who would risk renting a property where 6 people could have died from typhoid fever? She had to clear up the mystery once and for all. Then came a lucky break. Through friends, the Thompsons were introduced to Dr. George A. Soper, a sanitary engineer who was considered an expert epidemiologist. He called himself an epidemic fighter. Soper was known for his expert study of typhoid epidemics. He had investigated typhoid outbreaks in Boston, Ithaca, which is in New York, and several other cities, with much success. During one investigation, Soper evicted 2 typhoid patients and their families from their home and ordered the house burned down. Mrs. Thompson must have felt a glimmer of hope, for she hired Soper. Perhaps this man could solve the mystery without burning down her house. The Thompsons' new acquaintance wasn't a medical doctor. He wasn't a health professional. He wasn't even a scientist. George Albert Soper was a 36-year-old sanitary engineer who worked for the United States Army Sanitary Corps. He had graduated with a doctoral degree, a PhD from Columbia University's School of Mines. He liked to read medical articles and books and was especially interested in epidemiology, a science that studies the patterns, causes, and effects of the disease. Throughout the United States, city governments were hiring sanitary engineers like George Soper in order to improve living conditions and public health and try and prevent epidemics. Cities needed help. In 1900, for example, experts estimated that the average New Yorker threw away at least 160 pounds of food each year. 1,200 pounds of ashes from stoves and furnaces, and 100 pounds of miscellaneous items such as shoes, furniture, and other junk. And that wasn't all. New York City had more than 100,000 horses. Each horse dropped an average of 20 to 30 pounds of manure and as much as 4 gallons of urine each day. Without street cleaning, sewers, and regular garbage removal, this garbage, rubbish, and filth was left in the streets to rot. It eventually wended its way into the drinking water, contaminating it and spreading disease. Something had to be done. Working with city governments and city health departments, sanitary engineers designed apartment houses with better ventilation, and flushing toilets. They designed massive sewer systems to dispose of human waste. They planned public waterworks to supply safe, clean drinking water. These improvements helped reduce the incidence of typhoid disease by 67%. But for an ambitious epidemic fighter like George, 67% wasn't good enough. It meant that the danger of the epidemic still existed, and he had the numbers to prove it. In 1906, the same year as the Warrens' outbreak, New York City counted 3,467 cases of typhoid fever. That year, 639 people died. And when Miss Thompson explained her dilemma and asked for help, Soper listened. The sanitary engineer had many reasons to decline. It would be a difficult investigation. Weeks had passed since the outbreak. The Oyster Bay house was vacant and the victims long gone. It was a small case, too, for a man with Soper's experience and reputation, but he had a curious mind and the case intrigued him, so he agreed. To investigate. Interesting. Right away, Soper headed for Oyster Bay. He arrived at the Thompson house and rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The epidemiologist worked like a detective, gathering information from all types of sources to determine how disease spreads and how it can be controlled and eradicated. Soper retraced the steps of the earlier investigators, hoping to find a clue they overlooked. He tried to create a logical reconstruction of how the outbreak occurred. Soper began with the possibility of contaminants that might have been brought into the house from an outside source. Just as the early investigators had, he ruled out the possibility of contaminated milk, fruit, and vegetables. He collected samples from the faucets as well, the water storage tanks, the cesspool, and the privy. He sent the samples to the laboratory for testing. The test results were all negative. I was disappointed, said Soper later about the results. They had done their work thoroughly. Try as I could not find anything wrong. Perhaps the house itself was sick, looking into the house's history. Soper learned that one case of typhoid had occurred there 5 years earlier. But since then, the house had been rented out continually. No further outbreaks had occurred except for the people in the Warren household. That ruled out the house. He turned his attention to the Warrens and their habits. Even though he had ruled out contaminated milk, fruits, and vegetables, he felt certain that the infectious material must have been brought into the house, carried by a person or a piece of food. Might some clues have been overlooked? He reviewed the facts and found a clue. The Warrens were extremely fond of soft clams. They often brought clams from an old woman who lived in a tent on the beach not far from the Thompson house. Soper searched for her but was unable to find the woman. With the advent of winter, she had rolled up her tent and left. He inspected the beds where the clams were harvested and made an important discovery. They were sometimes taken from places where they were polluted with sewage, he noted. If the water was polluted, the clams were also polluted. But it still didn't make sense. If clams were responsible for the typhoid outbreak, Soper asked himself, why was the disease confined to one house? Most townspeople, it seemed, were fond of soft clams bought from the same woman or harvested from the same bay. Soper pressed further and found that the Warrens hadn't eaten clams after July 15th. Margaret Warren didn't fall sick until August 27th, 43 days later. Because typhoid fever has an incubation period of 10 to 14 days, clams could not be the culprit. It was frustrating, but Soper remained convinced that the disease had been carried into the house. But how, and by whom? If it wasn't the water, or the milk, or the fruit, or the vegetables, or the clams, if it wasn't the privy or the cesspools, who or what was it? Soper turned over the facts again, focusing on the month of August. He considered the order in which the disease struck. First, 9-year-old Margaret fell sick. Then, the 2 maids who attended her. Then her mother. Then her sister. And finally the gardener, who had worked at the house for several years. It wasn't simply the Warrens or the servants, noted the Soper. It was the Warrens and the servants. This was significant. Because of the progression of the disease, Soper felt certain that no one caught typhoid fever from Margaret. Each case, his instincts told him, was unique and caused by whomever or whatever had infected Margaret. George Soper traveled to the Warrens' home on New York's Upper East Side and interviewed them. He asked if anyone had left Oyster Bay for any reason. If so, he reasoned, that person may have become infected somewhere else and brought the disease home. But no, the Warrens told him. Not one family member had gone away, not one servant, not for a visit, a picnic, or any other reason, except the cook who had been fired. She had left Oyster Bay the first week in August and never returned. In her place, the Warrens had hired a new cook. This cook came with good recommendations. She had worked for some of the finest families. She began work on August 4th. Her name was Mary Mallon. Soper counted back the days in his head. Mary Mallon had begun cooking just 3 weeks before the typhoid epidemic broke out. Here was by all means the most important possibility in the way of a clue. Soper later wrote in a medical journal. It was a clue because the new cook was the only factor that had changed in the Warren household. He pressed further. What sort of meals had the new cook made? At last he learned that the Warrens had eaten raw fruit after all. The new cook had made a special dessert, homemade ice cream, with fresh cut-up peaches. It was delicious. She served it on Sunday, August 20th, just 16 days after she arrived. As a sanitary engineer, Soper knew that freezing didn't kill bacteria. All freezing did was make germs cold. He also knew that the intestinal tract, a coiled sausage-like tube that measures 5 feet long in an adult, is an ideal place for germs to grow. Once the bacteria-laden ice cream slides down your throat and moves from your stomach into your 98.6-degree intestines, a temperature at which bacteria thrive, the typhoid germs have found a warm, dark, moist environment in which to thrive and multiply. That growth happens quickly and profusely. One single bacterium cell can grow to 8 million cells in less than 24 hours. I suppose no better way could be found for a cook to cleanse her hands of microbes and infect a family. Soper put the facts together this way. The seemingly healthy Mary Mallon had a gallbladder and intestines teeming with typhoid bacteria. No doubt her hands played a part in it, he wrote. They became soiled when she visited the toilet, but whether from her urine or feces I have no way of knowing. After using the toilet, Mary had failed to wash her hands carefully before handling food. Soper conjectured. The bacteria from her urine, or fecal matter, were still on her hands or under her fingernails. In the act of peeling the peaches and cutting them up and churning the ice cream, she transferred the bacteria to the dessert and then served it. This reasoning led Soper to believe that the cook was to blame for the typhoid outbreak in the Warren household. In his article, Soper depicts Mary as a cook who had unclean habits. What Soper doesn't say is this: if Mary was infected with typhoid germs, it was nearly impossible for her to wash her hands well enough to eliminate the germs. She would have needed to scrub her hands front and back, between her fingers, and under her fingernails with soap and 140-degree water for a minimum of 30 seconds. Water that hot can cause a third-degree burn in just 5 seconds. If this woman could be found and questioned, said Soper, it seemed likely that she could give facts from which the cause of the epidemic could be ascertained. It wouldn't be easy to locate the missing cook. Weeks had passed since Mary Mallon quit the Warren household. Her present whereabouts were unknown, and Soper had no address. He had no telephone number, but Soper had her name and description. Mary Mallon, a tall Irish woman, now 38 years old, with clear blue eyes, a determined mouth, and a firm chin, who appeared to be in perfect health. And he knew that the Manhattan agency from which she had been hired. He intended to find the cook, even if it meant wearing out his shoes. So, lots happened. The Thompson family called in the help of George Soper. George Soper starts digging around, does all the same kind of investigative work as the investigators and the health department and all of them. And he realizes, that the only difference is Mary. That was the only thing that changed at the house. The kids didn't change. They didn't have visitors. Nobody left and went into the city and came back. None of that happened. The only difference was Mary. And so he thinks by tracking down Mary, they'll be able to have an answer as to what could have caused this. But he also talked about how this was like all over the place in New York. This is not an isolated incident that just happened one time. And if there was some kind of sickness or illness or bacteria or germ or whatever on Mary's hands, it would have been physically impossible for her to clean them well enough to get rid of it, because the temperature of the hot water would have given her burns. Anyway, this is an interesting book, guys. We'll see what happens next.